I've already recorded this video, but there were some things that I missed out, and so I decided to do it again. The first time I didn't have a script, this time I do. There are pluses and minuses in doing that. I mentioned before that if you do work in history, you realise that most of the histories are written by the winners. And in our case, Milton Hooke wrote a biography of Des, and in this sense this was a biography of the person who lost, depending on your point of view. When people who are the winners write a history, they cannot help but put their bias in that history. Amazingly, in this afternoon meeting, they did state some things that were helpful to our case. First of all, it was clear that they slagged Des and his reputation. He was arrogant, he couldn't be told anything, his scholarship was poor, he used sources wrongly. He could never be wrong. He was always the teacher, never the learner. The second point that the notes reveal is that Bob Brinsmead was a very large factor in the meeting on Friday afternoon. Most people at Glacier View would know absolutely nothing about the Brinsmead factor and about the story that I've already told you about John Brinsmead. The third thing that the notes record is that Des had a beautiful spirit, but I think that they wrote it to show that he capitulated by saying, you've done the right thing, I would do the same thing in your position, so I don't blame you, and so on. But as I read that out and did my video, Des came along and he listened to what I'd said. And one thing he said was, it was all about Brinsmead. I knew that way back at Glacier View, which is why I went out to find out what it was all about. But Des really noticed it this time when I read out the notes. And Des said there are many things that weren't recorded in those meeting notes. And he said that he did give a rebuttal to all of the accusations that were made against him. It mentions on this video, and I want to emphasise it here, the accusation that in his Glacier View manuscript he took things out of context. This was mentioned by Spangler a couple of times. And I wanted to point out to you that when men at the top say things like that, these accusations stick. And people would think, well, maybe he did shoddy work and he took things out of context, and so you can't rely on what Des said. One time after Glacier View in the 1980s, I don't know when it was, Robert Spangler was over to take meetings up at Tahoe, and he wanted to see us, and we drove up to Tahoe and met with him. I didn't think much of his attitude towards Des, even though he was a friend. And one thing he said that I can remember was, you think that you're some sort of a scholar. Again, putting down Des's qualification. But others would say, yes, he is a scholar. And Des said to me about this accusation that he took things out of context, that it was one particular person who accused him of this, and that person was Dr. Arthur Furch. In the pre-meetings with Dr. Hamill that I've mentioned before, I think, before Glacier View, there was a series of meetings, possibly 5 or 6, which Des attended, and there were others. Bill Johnson was there, Arthur Furch, Gerhard Dumsteeg, there were lots of them. And Des said Des said that when Arthur said this about him taking things out of context, he asked him, "Show me where I've taken things out of context." And Des said they never gave him anything. Des said that if those recordings, he thinks that they were taped, of the pre-meetings with Dr. Hamill were released, people would see that the information he was given to help change his mind was very thin. And he says that if people heard those recordings, he would be exonerated. But they've never been looked at as far as I know. So really that accusation that Des took things out of context just wasn't true. Des said to me he'd been working on this topic for 30 years and that he was very, very careful. And Arthur Patrick spoke of it as a very fine manuscript indeed. Now, we're not going to go on and on forever about Glacier View. In fact, we've never done anything quite like this. Des is now 88. I'm 73 this year. This is probably the last thing that we're going to say on Glacier View. Another thing that Des mentioned and I mentioned, well, I'm not sure if I did, but Des did. But I remember more about what happened because since Des has had the stroke, he doesn't remember as much as I do. Des had a fabulous memory for names, and even now his memory for names is better than most people. Together we often sit and try and work out people's names, and he may remember one thing and I might remember the other. He's not as good as he was, he's still good, but I do remember more detail. And in the years after Glacier View, when trying to think, we were in Auburn, California at Good News Unlimited, but our membership was at PUC, and occasionally we would go over and attend. And I remember one time Des got a standing ovation from the members. The same year, I think it was possibly it was an anniversary. It might have been 1987, but I can't remember. The anniversary of a return, the centennial, the second centennial at Avondale, and we went back for that. And Des got a standing ovation at Avondale College as well. But anyway, at PUC, every time there was a change of the senior minister, and the ones that I recall, there may have been more than 3. I suspect there was another one in there. Louis Vendon was one of the ministers, Ray Mitchell, who was an Australian and a friend of ours, and Roger Bothwell. Each time they would get a call from Elder Wilson to get rid of our membership, and each time they would come over and visit us. I remember Louis Vendon asking us, "Do you still want to stay members of the church?" And we said yes. And he said, "Well, that's the end of it. You want to stay, we want to keep you." And Fred Veltman, when we had that meeting in 1983, which I've spoken about, after which they took away Des's ordination, I was upset about it in the time. You get over these things. I wasn't upset about it for long. But I wrote a letter and handed in my membership at PUC. And Fred Veltman, friend and great scholar, called me and said, "Gill, please don't take your membership away, because if it ever comes up, the church wants to fight it." And so I didn't. The other visit I recall was Roger Bothwell, and Neil Wilson had called him, and he gave us the feeling that he hoped that we would retire and save him the trouble of doing anything about it. Des knew that Roger was not traditional, and he told him, "Well, if you feel you want to resign, you go ahead." But we didn't resign at that point. But Roger Bothwell told us that he said to Neil Wilson, "I've got no grounds on which to take away Des and Gill's membership." And Neil Wilson said to him, "If I wake up one day and the deed has been done, I'll be a very happy man." Lynn Bartlett told us, and I don't know when this was, possibly in the 80s, he lived next door to Neil Wilson in wherever it was, Washington DC, I guess. And he talked to Neil Wilson about Des in the hope that there might be some bringing Des back into the church. And Neil Wilson gave him the opinion that, if we'd had our time again, we might have done things differently. But at the same time, Neil Wilson was trying to get our membership taken away. When we came back to Australia in 2000 and 2001, Des told me he was going to write and hand in our membership, because he said we can't live in Australia and have our membership a PUC. It was all right when we were in America, and occasionally we could visit. And the other thing was that Des had come back because he had an invitation to teach at a Baptist college in Brisbane, in Queensland, Australia. And Des always missed teaching, and the thought of going back into teaching was very pleasing to him. And so we didn't do anything about our membership when we came back, but we did attend church. And Des attended for over a year. I gave up sooner. It was clear that we weren't welcome. It was a different climate when we came back in 2000. And about that time, or about the end of that year, Pastor Bruce Price, who was an outspoken right-winger, retired to Caloundra, and so we left. There was still a lot of fear about Des back then. And now in 2017, we've been going to a local church. And this is a church where the last 2 or 3 ministers have taught their congregation to love God and to love their fellow men. So they're very, very accepting of us. Des, of course, can't preach. He speaks up in Sabbath school, and people love it, as they used to love it. We don't go every week. We have other commitments. But that church truly has the love of Christ. It's the best church we've ever been to. And so we continue to go. Now, some people are surprised that we go back to church. But why not? We've never been bitter. We've understood the dilemma that the church was in back in 1980. People need to remember now that back then, material about Ellen White was not really in circulation. Ronald Numbers had written something about her, but The White Lie was not published by Walter Ray until 1982. I personally thought his material was propaganda, and I don't like that style of writing. I think that the facts are damning enough on their own without slanting them. However, often the main facts make no impact whatsoever. So people use propaganda, and it appeals to a certain type of mind that loves conspiracy, and the Adventist Church is full of that. Now, we've never been anti-Ellen White. A lot of her friends are, because of things like Walter Ray's book. And when they find out the truth about Ellen White as they see it, they just turn their back on her writings. Des still has all her books. He still regards her just as highly. Doesn't use her. Occasionally he quotes her when he preaches, but doesn't give the source. He says, if you use the Bible and you preach the gospel, if you have a problem with Ellen White, there's no use to use her, because she said the Bible and the Bible only. Now, when I came into the Adventist Church, I just wasn't taught the usual thing that generational Adventists were learned. from childhood. What I learned was that she was a wonderful Christian woman, she was very charitable, and she was a very devout woman. And I still believe all that. She was a creature of her times. She accepted some of the limited knowledge of her day, as the Bible writers did. I'm not comparing her to the Bible writers in saying that, but our culture and our limited knowledge limit what we say. She didn't live in these times when people have a very different attitude towards plagiarism. In the 19th century, Des says many of the people that he reads, they just borrowed from everybody and never said that they did. It was accepted. Poetry was different. You weren't supposed to plagiarise poetry. But I don't expect Ellen White to be perfect, and so all these things don't bother me, even when there's clearly a problem. And we know from experience, our own experience, that people can be told one thing and believe it, but when you look into it, there's two sides to the story, and when you hear the other side, you say, oh, I see. For instance, I understand that the first edition of The Great Controversy, the sources were given in the introduction, but that was taken out of later editions. I just wanted to add a little bit here. Des, having listened to what I said I wasn't quite correct about Great Controversy. In the introduction, Ellen White says on page 11, X1, the history I have presented briefly in accordance with the scope of the book and the brevity which must necessarily be observed, the facts having been condensed into as little space as seemed consistent with a proper understanding of their application. In some cases where a historian has so grouped together events as to afford, in brief, a comprehensive view of the subject, or has summarised details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted, but in some instances no specific credit has been given, since the quotations are not given for the purpose of citing that writer as an authority, but because his statement affords a ready and forcible presentation of the subject. In narrating the experiences and views of those carrying forward the work of reform in our own time, similar use has been made of their published works. So Ellen White tells you what she's done. The other thing that Des said to me was that in the early books there was a bibliography where 200 books were listed that gave the books that were used in Great Controversy. So that puts a different light on Ellen White's borrowing in this case. Ellen White herself, the Oxford Unity Press put out a book about Ellen White. She's never been given the credit. People outside are seeing us, outside the church, see her as more remarkable than those in the church. She was much better than the way she's been used to control the people. I live in Australia, and over here we'd say, give her a fair go. Now, we were talking about the ministers at PUC, and Ray Mitchell, who was one of the ministers who came to visit us and had a time at PUC, was treated extremely badly when he was there. Ministers go through hell with the brethren. They also often get it from the congregation. And always, if the congregation doesn't agree with the ministers, it only takes 1, 2 or 3. They start to call the conference office and the minister's in trouble. So they often get it in the neck, both ends, from the people at the top, their bosses, also from the congregation. Ray and Robin Mitchell and their beautiful daughter were profoundly decent people, hugely gifted. They gave their all for the church. An accusation was made. It was very serious. Ray was asked to leave while it was settled. He was told by the church lawyers not to mention it at all. He didn't even talk to us about it. He was a very close friend. The other party had no such stricture. He went around PUC with a gun in his pocket. He blackened Ray's name everywhere. Months later it went to court and it was thrown out. Ray had gone to study chaplaincy at a chaplaincy school in Phoenix, Arizona. He was so good that they asked him to be the head of the school. Later, after the judge threw the court case out, the church offered him a job back, but he'd have never come back. His daughter was hugely talented, bright, vivacious, gifted. She was graduating the time that all this was happening, when her father got dismissed. It devastated her life. Here's three amazing people lost to the church. This sort of thing happens all the time. Gospel ministers have been treated like this and they disappear, and often the church people let it happen. They don't bring the leaders to account. After Glacier View, almost all the colleges, except Southern, sent petitions to Neil Wilson, signed by the faculty. They were binned, put in the rubbish bin. No doubt somebody wrote down all the names of those who'd signed, and a lot of them got put out too. The European division at the time after Glacier View sent Malaris Caparis to Neil Wilson with a lot of signatures. This was the Germanic divisions, Holland, Germany, possibly Austria. I don't know about the divisions. But all the Germanic ministers signed it. They said, why can't we don't agree with the traditional position here in Europe. Why can't we keep Des in and have a difference of opinion? And Neil Wilson said, we have done what we've done. The same old stuff keeps going on. The traditional right wing have the ascendancy. They always had, since 1919, since the 1930s, since 1980. Ministers often know these things. A lot of them have advanced thinking. From what people tell us, the investigative judgment is pretty much dead. But the lay people are kept in the dark. They're fed the same old stuff in the Sabbath school pamphlets. And a lot of times the people who were the editors, Erwin Gain was one of them, they heavily edit what's given to them, change what the author said, so the people are not fed. The people have no idea what goes on in the church. They listen to 3ABN, Doug Batchelor preaches traditional Adventism. Now I say this from what people tell me. I don't listen to it. So that's the situation. A minister in America, a young minister, wrote to Des not long ago, we hear from all over the world. And you would be absolutely amazed at the love that comes towards Des because of his ministry. But this minister said, we ministers have been taught about the gospel and about all these things that have changed in thinking. But he's the one who said the people in the pews are fed by Adventist media and the Sabbath school pamphlet, so they're kept in the dark. And recently, what about Gary Kent? Do you know what happened to him? Cannot you see that the brethren are at it again? all an issue of control. Here's a man, a Christian. He's had a lot of success. He's preached the gospel. He's more traditional than we would be. He probably doesn't consider Des Ford a friend of his. But people love him. But from what I've heard, there's been a lot of mismanagement in the media centre. The brethren never back down. They may get a reaction from people initially, but they just hunker down, go to mediation, wait for it all to quieten down. And by the time they've finished, the people will have forgotten about it. When you know that this happens, you expect it. And you have to focus on the gospel, your personal love for God, and the thankfulness for what He's done for you. I came from a worldly background. I have no regrets. Becoming an Adventist, it changed my life. I was a smoker, I was a drinker, I was a party goer. I had no direction for my future. And I'm grateful I became an Adventist. I've got no regrets about it, despite what happened. Again, thank you for listening to me. The first time I did this talk was 12 minutes. It's now 25. I've doubled up somehow. But after this, I'm finished with Glacier View, as far as I know. I'll do a few more stories, but I shall go back into my gospel cage, helping Des wherever I can, to keep on presenting the gospel of Christ, the love of Christ, God's mercy for us. Thank you.